Tonight on Free Minds TV, we talk about the BearCat armored personnel carrier. We'll also be talking about surveillance drones, the Ron Paul presidential campaign, and the situation in the Middle East. Coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Thank you very much for tuning in to episode 241, season 7. I think it's episode 5 of Free Minds TV, somewhere around there, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
Well, Nick, we've got some stories to talk about. I think we've touched on, well, all of these before. So it's kind of like an update show, or, yeah, it's talking about issues we've already talked about in the past.
Well, a lot of the things we talk about are their themes more than they are individual news stories. So it's not surprising that we do follow up and that the stories develop and that news stories emerge out of the ones we've already covered. And there was a story we were covering here in the local area. I mean, this show is on, across New Hampshire and in a number of different states, and it's available anywhere in the world online. So we've covered this. It's a local issue, but I think it's an important one to cover because it reflects what's taking place across the United States. And that is the fact that the city of Keene is looking at acquiring a BearCat armored vehicle, which is it's basically an armored personnel carrier. We've showed the video on the program before, and it looks a lot like what you would think of as a piece of military hardware, an assault vehicle. Now, the argument being made was that, number one, the Keene Police Department needs an assault vehicle, and number two, they're mostly going to be using it for rescue purposes and things like that anyway.
Well, now, I want to, before we talk about the specific case here in Keene, it's not only Keene, New Hampshire that's applying for this grant to obtain this BearCat. This is happening all over the country. The federal government is issuing these, or allowing localities to apply for these grants to militarize the police, like they've been doing for the last decade plus. So, I mean, this isn't an isolated incident that's only happening here in Keene, New Hampshire. This is going on everywhere. There's just quite a bit of opposition to it from individual citizens here in Keene, New Hampshire. Not so much the city council so far. There was that lone voice who stood up against it here in Keene, but this is happening everywhere. A lot of citizens have been upset about it the last couple of months. Lots of letters to the editor. So I do want to just preface that we're talking about it here. There's a lot of opposition, but this is happening all over the place, militarizing the police with federal grants.
Right. And, the Keene City Council, to their credit, did under a good deal of public pressure, because initially I don't think there were any intentions of ever holding a hearing on this. The idea was just, well, if the police department gets the grant, which apparently they've gotten that clearance, we'll let them get the BearCat armored vehicle. However, there was a public backlash. There were, and it wasn't just us talking about it, but it was discussed in a local newspaper. As you said, Toby, letters to the editor, and a lot of people raising concerns about this. So the Keene City Council, to their credit, did hold a public hearing and allowed the public, to give their input. And the review, I attempted to go, but I just couldn't fit it into my schedule. But from what I've heard, it was a well-attended meeting. They ultimately had to turn people away because the building was too full, according to fire code. And overall, most of the responses, most of the people who bothered to come out and speak, were speaking out against the Keene Police Department acquiring this vehicle. And you have to remember, Keene, New Hampshire is not a big city. It's a town of 25,000. You might be able to call it a small city. Many people out there would call a town of 25,000 a small town. But I think you're right, Toby. This is part of that larger theme of the militarization of police forces across the country. And I was speaking with somebody who used to be on the Keene Police Force, and they were supportive of the idea of them acquiring this because a lot of the incidents they've had to deal with things like bank robberies and other major violent crimes, police-involved shootings, have increased. But I think the issue here is you really need to look at why small-town police departments feel they need to make the case to have an armored vehicle. And I think it has a lot to do with the way the police forces are used. I think it has a lot to do with the war on drugs. And if you look at most of the bank robberies, most of the violent crimes that take place in this area, where they didn't really happen so much before, it's most of it drug-related, over 50% of it. If you read through the police section of the newspaper, the crime section of the newspaper, and you read about all of the crimes against people and property, most of the violent crimes out there, most of the robberies are drug related.
I'm still not sure. I'm sorry. Yes, you're correct. We've talked about that many times. What's an armored vehicle do for a bank robbery?
Exactly. Well, that's the thing, is most of the situations where police shootings occur...
It's not a hostage situation, so those aren't happening.
Right. And even if it is, when you consider a hostage situation, for the most part, either you're negotiating with a person or negotiations have failed and the police are going to go in and neutralize the person. Or if you have a public shooting incident, police are going to have to go into a building and take care of that. So no matter what you arrive at the scene in, whether it's a squad car or a $400,000 armored personnel carrier, ultimately you're going to have to get out of the vehicle at some point. I mean, if the police are just going to pull up in their vehicles and sit there, I don't really see what impact they're going to have on. And if you need an armored personnel carrier, you should be dealing with a violent individual here. So I would hope that police are responding quickly to those incidents. I understand that they want to make it home, they don't want to get shot, but when you think about the costs, and just what the vehicle symbolizes to a large extent, is it really worth it?
I think that's my major problem. I mean, in the drop of the bucket, it's paid for by federal dollars. Yes, that's tax money. It's borrowed money for the most part, adding to the deficit. It's just a teeny little drop in a larger bucket. So it's more of the principle, the message that it's sending, that I have an issue with it. I mean, is this going to completely militarize the police? No, but it's that extra add-on and add-on and add-on, and suddenly we don't need this now. It would be nice for the fire department and the police force to have, they say. It's not needed right now, but if they get it, you bet it's going to then be a necessity. And every time you add on something you haven't had before, it's a necessity. And that's true of everything. It doesn't have to be the police department. I mean, think of what you do in your everyday life, the internet. It's a necessity now. It wasn't a necessity 10, 15, 20 years ago. Not at all. But now it's an absolute must. So is a computer. So is your cell phone. So is everything that's an add-on now. All the features that you have in your brand new car, didn't have those in the old car, but now it's a necessity to have them in this car. So once you get something like this, you can't get rid of it. And yes, it might be free with the federal grant, but it's going to require people to be trained to drive it, people to be staffed to drive it, of course, upkeep, mechanical work. So it will be costly on the local level, but it's also that principle. I did say that, the principle of militarizing the police force. I remember way back when we first started this show, we talked a lot about peace officers, way back when police officers weren't law enforcement officers. They were there to keep the peace, was more of the idea. Maybe I'm just hearkening to the good old days that never really existed. As Kurt Vonnegut says, there's no such thing as the good old days. We always just harken back to a better time. Kind of like we say, well, back when the politicians followed the Constitution back 100 years ago. Well, who are we kidding? What happened in World War I with the Constitution? I mean, it was completely eviscerated. There was no freedom of the press. You'd go to jail and be locked up if you badmouthed the war.
Right,
so, were there the good old days? I like to say peace officers in the 50s.
Right.
Did that really exist, or is that just something nice that I like to think of in the past?
Yeah, and at that point, it's a good one to raise, because it puts things in perspective, because certainly the Wilson and Lincoln administrations have done a lot more, if you look at the historical record, to eviscerate the Bill of Rights than what's taking place now. But I think it's important to remember, Toby, from that, if you recognize the fact, and if you really look at history, and look at what was done during the Civil War, look at what was done during World War I and World War II, with things like internment camps, with Wilson's policies of imprisoning thousands of people, you can see that things can get better. And the period we're in now, I think a lot of people feel it's hopeless. They feel like this trend towards, the militarization of local law enforcement and things like that, the erosion of civil liberties, are going to continue. But we've seen worse things in the past. We really have. So you have to remember that you go through bad times, and then good times usually come again. How quickly we get back to better times really depends on what we do. And the last point I'd like to make on it is whether you're really concerned about the impact that it has of a militarized local police force. A federalized police force is also something that concerns me, because we've seen what grant money and what funding routed through Washington, D.C. have done to things like healthcare and education. And it's really removed a lot of the decision-making from the state and local level, especially with something like education, and has turned it into this issue that's debated in Washington, D.C., that's decided by the Department of Education, and individual parents, teachers, school districts really don't have a lot of input. And when we see the Department of Homeland Security buying equipment for local law enforcement agencies, if this trend continues, I don't think it's really too much of a stretch to say that increasingly local police departments and maybe local fire departments are going to some extent be federalized, and we're going to lose a lot of the decision-making power we have on the local level, and we'll face mandates just like we do with education and healthcare and roads and virtually everything else.
Yeah, well, they won't necessarily be the federal a branch of the federal government, but there will be strings attached, I think is what you're saying.
Right. Well, just like they do today
right,
with the funding. I mean,
yeah. With every state, for example, every state except New Hampshire has an 18. Everybody has to buckle. Here in New Hampshire, it's 18 and up because we don't take those federal strings attached to the highway.
Well, we don't.
fund,
We lose out on like 10% of it. But yeah, I mean, there are strings attached, whether it's the DOT or the DOE or, in this case, the Department of Homeland Security. And frankly, a lot of the services that are delivered through the federal government, there are a lot of services that I don't think need to be delivered by government to begin with. But even if you do think they need to be, why are we doing it through Washington, D.C., where there's no constitutional authority to do it, and where the decision-making is pretty much completely taken out of your hands and you really have no voice? I'd rather make decisions about things like that at the state and local level.
Okay, question for you, Nick. Here's a libertarian conundrum for you, all right? Has to do with drones. We've been talking a lot about drones recently. Last week, I think we were talking about the United States using them in foreign lands to slay foreign dragons, and unfortunately use them to attack some funerals and attack first responders from the first drone attacks and kill a lot of innocent people. We've also talked about the United States using them right here in U.S. states, especially on the border, to spy on Americans, to look for drug traffickers. So they're becoming more and more popular flying over the United States, and most of them are for surveillance purposes, but they do have the power to blow people away. They also have the power to use facial recognition, for example, for miles up in the air. That's becoming a reality. So they can do a lot. Are they a scary technology? Yes. Are they inevitable technology? Well, it seems so. My libertarian conundrum for you is, what do you do about it? The FAA is what's actually preventing drones from being all over the skyways right now. It's an agency where we've said before, this doesn't need to be run by the federal government. We could get rid of them, right? But in a sense, I also don't want drones everywhere from all sorts of different alphabet soup agencies in the federal government spying on us, as well as private corporations spying on us as well. So this is one that's perplexing me a little. Maybe some people have some answers for me. The FAA Reauthorization Act, which President Barack Obama is expected to sign, also orders the Federal Aviation Administration to develop regulations for the testing and licensing of commercial drones by 2015. Privacy advocates say the measure will lead to widespread use of drones for electronic surveillance by police agencies across the country and eventually by private companies as well. Quote, there are serious policy questions on the horizon about privacy and surveillance by both government agencies and commercial entities, said Stephen Aftergood, who leads the project on government secrecy at the Federation of American Scientists. The Electronic Frontier Foundation also is, quote, concerned about the implications for surveillance by government agencies, said Attorney Jennifer Lynch. The provision in the legislation is the fruit of a, quote, huge push by lawmakers and the defense sector to expand the use of drones in American airspace, she added. Now, the agency projects, the FAA that is, projects that by 2020, about 8 years from now, there will be 30,000 drones flying around in the air above us. So
30,000 is a lot of drones. Now, I think
we've been complaining about one or two.
Right. 30,000 is getting to the point where it's ubiquitous. It's just everywhere, and you don't even notice it. It'll be the new normal, just like airport security is now. I think the story does well to point out that government is by its very nature, a bureaucratic institution, so it's slow-moving, and you've got these different bureaucracies. In this case, the FAA will hold up other bureaucracies like DHS and the ATF and the FBI from putting drones in the sky to track us. Now, I don't know if the FAA is necessarily the answer, Toby. Ultimately, all these guys work for the same boss, and eventually the FAA will approve drones at some point. With the amount of pressure that's there, they'll just do it, whether it's
not
safe or
being
not.
a slow bureaucracy. It's not preventing these drones from flying around above us because it's concerned about our liberties. It's doing it just because it's the nature of the way the machine works.
Right. And I mean, I don't know how you address that issue except to put restrictions on government.
What about private companies?
Whether they fly drones or not. That's another good question. And
because this is no longer, we've always, the answer, the libertarian answer is, well, if you're on public property, the private companies have a right to surveil you, to track you, to do whatever they want to do.
Right.
But these drones, that takes it out of the public sector. Now they're going to be tracking you on your private property.
Right. Yeah. And there's that question of, I think one could argue a court case on the idea that if you're observing people on private property, which almost by necessity you'd have to do in real time, I think it's very much different than, say, taking a satellite photograph of the Earth or something like that. But you're observing people in real time. You can focus in on their backyard, literally, where they have a fence up. And, there are laws against basically peeping in a lot of states. There are laws against invading people's privacy if they're on their own private property and they have a reasonable expectation to privacy. So I think you can rein in the private side use of these drones that way.
Yeah, but isn't that just wishful thinking? How are you, there's 30,000 of them going to be flying around. How are you going to rein them in and make sure that they're not secretly collecting information?
Well, I assume they're flying them to collect information. You basically just say, well, if your camera happens to sweep by somebody's private backyard, then you just broke the law. So you basically criminalize drones.
Yeah.
But that's very hard to do because people look down from aircraft. You could legally prohibit the use of drones.
I suppose.
It's probably not going to happen. I mean, my concern isn't so much the private side. In a perfect world, if there wasn't a government around to worry about, or a large government around to worry about these corporations giving the information to, I don't know if Pepsi wants to fly a drone around and learn more about my soda consumption habits. If they think that that is somehow profitable, go for it. It's a little weird, but I'm not really that scared of what Pepsi or Coke or John Deere or Ford is going to do in a vacuum. But the reality of the world that we live in is that we do have that big government around that would like to aggregate data on us, and they can use and are today using information collected by the private sector simply by purchasing it. And it's a complete end run around all the protections in the Bill of Rights. And in practical terms, we're allowing private companies to collect the information, then we're allowing them to give it to the government. And you've basically, the private companies are far more effective than the government ever used to be at amassing just the sheer volumes of data that they do. And when you think about all the information that goes into building your credit score, a lot of that information is up for sale, and it can be sold to the government. So that's a complete end run around the protections in the Bill of Rights, because nothing says that they can't buy information that was collected by private companies. Private companies aren't restricted by the Bill of Rights. And I think in the world we live in, laws in place that prevent companies from sharing information with the government at the very least, I am more than okay with that.
But essentially, what we're saying here, if I hear you correctly, is in the next 10 years, less than 10 years, the new norm is going to be we're accepting the drones, collecting this information, selling it to the government, using whatever they want to do with it for commercial purposes, just like we currently are internet companies.
Right, yeah, your ISP collects a bunch of it. Unfortunately...
So we can no longer complain about drone stories. Because it's the new norm almost. It's going to be, right?
Yeah, 10 years from now it probably will be. And it's unfortunate. I mean, we are entering into a period of time where really most of our lives take place in some, here in the United States, most of our lives are taking place, even if they're taking place in real space, in the real world, there's some kind of connection to a database. I mean, you take your smartphone with you wherever you go, and I've pointed out that that creates a record of basically everywhere you've been. You might as well wear an ankle bracelet. I mean, we might as well all be parolees, just based on the usage of our smartphones. When you consider the amount of information that's available through Facebook, most people pay for virtually everything. A lot of people pay for virtually everything with plastic these days. So there's a record of everything you've ever bought, and a lot of that information, your consumption habits and your lifestyle, they can patch all that together from your purchases, Toby. Yeah, I mean, and I could go on, and the drone story is going to add to that. But we're going to be living in a world where an immense amount of information is available on almost every single one of us. And we're just not, I mean, unless you make some serious lifestyle changes and decide to opt out of a lot of this stuff, and that's difficult these days. If you want to remain competitive in the business world and everything like that, we're going to be living in a world where a lot more information is collected on us day to day, whether it's by private companies or the government. The potential for that information to wind up in the hands of the government or be misused by any of those parties is huge. And I think we need more stringent privacy protections, not less stringent privacy protections.
It's still just crazy. It seems like just weeks ago I was ranting and raving about a single drone being used. 30,000 of them in less than 10 years.
We'll see whether that bears out. I mean, maybe we'll get lucky and they're wrong.
Why would they be? It's very cool technology. All right. I guess we've talked about him enough, and then we can't just ignore him as he starts to fuddle out here. It's kind of, let's be honest here, it's what we predicted. No, it's no surprises. When Ron Paul announced that he was running for president once again for a third time, we said it will be a great educational experience for some people. He'll spread the messages around freedom and liberty and constitutional practices to millions of people. So that'll be the best education you can really hope for, really mainstream. Yeah, it's going to go over most people's heads, but you're going to definitely reach millions of people, and I think he's definitely done that. But is it time to concede on the...
Now, I've never thought that Ron Paul was going to win the Republican nomination. The bad news that's come out, I actually think it's fairly good news, Teppy. He lost the state of Maine 36 to Romney's 39, and they didn't hold the caucus in the county in which Ron Paul had done the best last time around. I'm not going to cry foul play, but in that particular case, I think there might have been some gamesmanship behind that. But he came in a very strong second place in Maine. He did quite well in Minnesota, coming in 27%, I think. And then there's been a host of other states like Missouri and Colorado where he really didn't do so well. I think I'm virtually sure that we will see Romney be the nominee. Ron Paul might manage to pick up enough delegates to be able to bargain with him a little bit at the convention, depending on how much the vote remains split between Romney and Santorum and Gingrich. They might need Paul's delegates, but yeah, I don't know what's really going to come out of it. I think that the campaign has been effective in the ways that you mentioned. It's introduced people to the ideas of limited government again. It's reignited debate in the popular culture about monetary policy, about American foreign policy. So I think the campaign's been a lot more successful at spreading ideas than almost any other venue the Liberty Movement's had, really, since its modern inception, to be quite honest.
So here's a real quick question, Nick. Let's just say Ron Paul decides to threaten Mr. Romney and say, I'm going to run for a third party if you don't allow me to run as your vice president. Now, number one, is there any chance of that? And number two, would that cause you to vote for a Romney-Paul ticket?
You know, if Paul were the VP, I would have to think about it. I don't know what good that's going to do. I think the odds of right. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. Number one, because
it's wild speculations. I've been reading the internet.
Yeah, there are a lot of wild speculations on the internet. I'd almost be more likely to vote for a Romney ticket if Paul were Treasury Secretary or something. The vice president doesn't have any real power. If you made him Treasury Secretary or something like that, where he could really, start having some leverage on the Fed, I might think about it. But barring a very unlikely scenario where it's basically a Paul Romney ticket, I'm just going to vote third party, and I would encourage everybody who wants real change to do the same thing. I mean, if it's going to be an election about who's better, Romney or Obama, frankly, I don't care. I think the differences between their positions. I mean, the Obamacare thing it's just a federal version of Romney's healthcare package, and a lot of the things that people have been upset with Obama about, Romney's not going to be any better. He's not really going to slash government in any kind of real terms. So my hope is, Toby, that all of the dissatisfaction that we've seen out there over the last couple of years that have expressed themselves through the Tea Party and the Occupy camps, I hope that people on both sides will just vote for somebody else. I don't care whether it's the Libertarian candidate or the Constitution Party candidate. If you're if you would otherwise be an Obama supporter, but you want real change, maybe go out and vote for the Green Party. If they're on the ballot in your state, just vote for anybody else. I think it'd be nice if we could break the stranglehold that the two major parties have on political power in the U.S., because I think with a two-party system, it's a lot easier to dupe people. And it's a lot more complicated to manage a multi-party system and control the leadership of every party and switch off between 4 or 5 different parties instead of 2.
Yeah.
So I don't know that that's a panacea. I don't know that that'll fix everything. But
well, yeah, the only
I don't
thing
think it'll
worse,
hurt. I don't think voting for the status quo is going to fix anything.
What's worse than a 3-party system would be a 2-party system, I think. 3 parties not that much better, but 2 parties definitely much worse. Does it go exponentially so? I don't know. Yeah, I see these other countries that have like 15 parties. They're not in all that much better shape either, unfortunately, though. So I don't know the answer, Nick. I'm not full of answers tonight. As we recap these stories we've talked about over and over again, I think I'm left with more questions than answers. So love to get your thoughts and emails this week. freemindstv.com. From there, click on the contact box. Easiest way to contact us. I'd like to get some feedback on tonight's show.
You know who I'm excited about? Gary Johnson. We haven't had a chance to talk about him because he dropped out of the Republican
Third party
race.
candidate.
He is going to be right. He's trying to get the nomination for the Libertarian Party.
He's a good man.
Yeah, we've had the chance personally to talk with Gary a couple of times when he was campaigning here as a Republican in New Hampshire for the primary, and I've got, I'll jump right on that bandwagon as soon as we start gearing up for the general election. I mean, that's my plan right now because, unfortunately, it doesn't look like Ron Paul's going to win the nomination. But maybe he'll shake things up. Maybe he'll even win a couple states. There's still a lot of states left to vote, and he's come very, very close.
That's true.
Less than 3 points in both Maine and Iowa from the top spot. So,
question for you, Nick. Did you plug the unpeace in the Middle East?
I think I did, but
all right,
we're
guess
be
what?
Able to get to it.
The Middle East, they're still not happy over there. So,
despite everything we've done for them.
All that foreign intervention and still unhappiness. All right, until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a great night.